So Five Nights at Freddy's is a game that I genuinely really care about. I mean, I've been following the games ever since it first came out back in 2014. And even to this day, I still play a lot of the FNAF games, even some of the older ones, and the majority of the streams on my channel are either some of the original FNAF games or FNAF fan games. When during my 24-hour live stream of the FNAF games, I decided to start playing Ruin, I was incredibly impressed with how much better it was compared to base game Security Breach. Like, the majority of the things that I can remember from Security Breach is that back when it first came out, nearly 2 years ago now, it just came out really buggy and horrid and nobody liked it at the start. Especially after there'd been a big hype for a really highly developed FNAF game that was gonna be open world. Especially after all the heavy delays and it coming out like it did, it was a very big disappointment for most of the fan base. However, over time, Steel Wool has managed to get rid of some of these bugs, and whilst it's not bug-free, it's a lot better than what it used to be. The game is really good, but it's not perfect. There's a lot of things that are still wrong with it, and even when not talking about the bugs, there's still a lot of things in the game that really drag it down a notch. However, when Steel Wool announced that they were going to be releasing a DLC for the game, and it came out being absolutely fucking amazing, it was such a big shock to me and most people that played through the DLC. And while I don't want to talk for everyone, most people can say that Ruin is such a massive improvement compared to base game Security Breach. And for this video in particular, I'm going to talk about what makes it so much better than the base game, how it improved and changed some of the features that used to be in the base game, and just how it's just such a big breath of fresh air for the franchise. And I'm not going to go over through all of the gameplay that's in the game and what happens because that would take way too long, but I'll just give you a quick run through of what basically happens. But starting off at the beginning of the game, we play as a girl called Cassie who's looking for Gregory. We are told that Gregory has given her a message to come to the Pizzaplex, however when she gets there, Gregory is nowhere to be found. And after walking through the Pizzaplex for a little bit, we pick up a radio and are told from Gregory that he is trapped on the Roxy Raceway. And from that point on, the rest of the game consists of shutting down security nodes to eventually get to Roxy Raceway and find Gregory. And then obviously along the way, we run into animatronics, and they're just so much more broken down than we see them at the end of Security Breach. And then obviously as we go through the Pizzaplex, we go through the animatronics' different areas, one by one, eventually getting to the raceway. Obviously, this is a really shortened down version of the game, there is a lot more to it, but it is just such a good experience. I really think that you should go and watch it. At least if you can't play it. If you can play it, then play it. It is a free DLC, so if you already own Security Breach, then you can play Ruin. But if you do own Security Breach, you probably have already played Ruin, but if you haven't, go do it. It's such a good DLC. So first of all, the main differences between the games is that in the base game, obviously it was really fucking buggy, and because it was a big open world game, obviously if you have a game that's big and open world, you're gonna get bugs. On top of this, there was way too many endings, even for a FNAF game, and that's even talking over FNAF 6, who had 7 endings, I'm pretty sure. But at least when it came to FNAF 6, it was pretty easy to tell which one was the canon ending. With Security Breach, we had basically no idea until Ruin came out. At least with FNAF 6, it was pretty certain to say, ah yeah, the ending that's the canon one is the one that has all of the really important characters included in it. However, with Security Breach, yeah, Burn Trap was there, and yet that was not the canon ending, even with the blob included. And talking about Enviroment, the game was really bright, and with the big neon lights, it just wasn't scary, apart from probably the section with the endos, but apart from that, everything was way too bright and cheery, and it just was really impossibly not scary. And probably the big kicker for me is that some parts of the games were more rushed compared to other parts. Like, for example, the boss battle with Monty is a lot more, like, there's more stuff put into it than Chica's section with the sewers. However, with the release of the DLC, it was a lot more linear, which means there was a lot less bugs. There's only a few endings, which means it's more easier to tell which one could possibly be canon. It's a lot more darker, which means it's a lot more spookier. And I will say that there are genuinely times in Ruin where I got the absolute shit scared out of me, which I can't say the same for the base game. And most of the parts of the games don't feel rushed. Yeah, there's still some parts which could have been longer, but overall, it was just really well done. Nothing really feels like it has more stuff put into it than others. But going into a more in-depth comparison, we can start with the actual gameplay itself. In base game Security Breach, it basically just used to be walking around, going to different fetch quests and a few security room sections every now and then. And eventually, after doing this a couple of times, we'd go into a boss fight, quote unquote. I say that because the only real section that seemed like an actual boss fight was the Monty section. All of the others were kind of just plain animation, the animatronic is dead now, that was it. I say dead, but I mean more of just they become their shattered forms. However, I will give Security Breach the credit that possibly one of the best sections in the game was the endo sections and the area with Roxy. After destroying her, and we get that area underneath where everything's on fire. And obviously, like I said before, the Monty fight is another really good section of the game that I enjoy quite a bit. However, most of the other sections of the game are either shot through really fast. For example, the actual animation for fighting Roxy, we just kind of run her over with a car, which is a lot less compared to Monty's fight. What is probably the most common opinion is that Sun and Moon's area is way too short. And if a section of the game isn't way too short, it's way too tedious. For example, the Mazer-size area, nobody likes mazes. Mazes are just a very unnecessary part of games. My personal opinion is that Phaser Blast and the Gregory Have the Vent Room are just the same. Like, a majority of the gameplay is just walking to a location and either getting an item or pressing a button, and that's it. The only difference with Phaser Blast is that you're just moving to a location, shooting for a bit, move to the next location, etc. Same with the Gregory Have the Vent Room. You just run around, press a button, run to the next button, press that, and every now and then just run to the door, press it, zap an animatronic, and that's the whole entire thing. Same with the security rooms, it's just press buttons, you're good. But while some parts of the games are genuinely enjoyable, the big majority of the game is just really mid, and I don't enjoy it. However, when going into the Ruin DLC, I feel like there's a lot more of a consistent gameplay throughout it. While yeah, it is a lot of the same kind of puzzles, at least it has some kind of increase in the difficulty throughout its runtime. For example, the wire minigames gets more wires, and the security nodes will increase in child nodes, and the actual grid puzzle part of it will gain more pieces that you have to worry about. Also brings back more of the entertaining parts of the base game, like the Monty Golf ball shooter things, and we actually get to see Sun and Moon again, with an addition to the endos outside of the daycare. It kind of just gets the good parts of the base game and makes them even better, or entwines them with regular gameplay. The DLC is just really good at improving on gameplay, which in the base game felt either lackluster or repetitive. And instead of just completing fetch quests and button pressing in between the fun parts, we actually have a continuous purpose. Getting rid of the security nodes is enjoyable because it has a purpose other than just to gain an item and then repeat the process until the game ends. On top of this, there's a significantly less amount of bugs compared to the base game. Now, I'm not saying that there's none whatsoever, but it's a very big improvement to what we had before. Speaking of large improvements, I want to talk about the physical design of the new DLC. Before, in the base game, everything is shrouded in a bright neon light and it makes it extremely hard to find it scary. And I'm going to put it out there that I personally think that this is actually a good thing, but only now that Ruin has been released. Seeing a location that was once bright and vibrant be now broken down and abandoned adds a lot more to the actual vibe that Ruin gives off, and it most likely wouldn't have been so effective if the base game wasn't so bright and cheery. The now abandoned Pizzaplex lets us see locations and recognize them from a time when it wasn't so ruined, and it adds so much more to it that it would otherwise lack without those memories. It's like looking at those images of places that you used to see in your childhood that are now completely abandoned. Like, for example, that image of the old Teletubbies set where everything is just completely flooded now and it's just a lake. Same specifically for me with the Splat-A-Lot set. I used to watch Splat-A-Lot a lot when I was a kid. And seeing it now just completely abandoned just gives this really uncanny feeling to it. Even in the AR world, it's done in a way that doesn't break the illusion of the Pizzaplex being broken down. We can clearly see that whilst in the network, things are still broken and in dismay. They aren't teleported to a place that looks purely as code or circuitry. It is meshed with the real world in a way that makes the AR world look just as abandoned as the real one. On top of these, we can see sections of this AR world that are not only meshed with the real world, but actually mesh with Cassie's mind as well. Things like certain objects and items in the real world being replaced by Roxy versions of them, or the cardboard cutouts now including Cassie on them. This AR world is also tapping into Cassie's mind and making her see things in the way she either wants to see them, or it's connecting the AR world to her in a way that makes her like it more, possibly an attempt to make her want to stay in it and continue taking down these nodes. Also, just looking at it from a game design view, the player might not even notice some of these until repeat playthroughs, which is something that I really like a lot in games. Being able to play something for a second time and noticing things that you didn't see before is just a really neat feature to games that needs to be done more often. However, what I would call my favorite part of Ruin is the changes to the characters and the new characters that were added in. Starting off with who is probably one of my favorite improvements in the new DLC is Roxanne. Roxy has always been my favorite animatronic from Security Breach, and seeing her get a higher importance in the DLC as a sort of redemption to her character is just what she needed. And while she may not be my favorite physical design to come out of the Ruin DLC, I still love the way that Steel Wool added a little bit more to her, other than her just being an egotistical, emotional character. So I just want to talk about that for a second. Even back in Security Breach, I thought that Roxanne was probably the most tragic character in the game. Being a replacement to a fan favorite character like Foxy, she doesn't believe that she'll ever be good enough to fill that position. The egotistical display that she gives off throughout the game is just to disguise her crippling sense that she's never gonna be good enough. Especially after we as Gregory take away what is possibly her one thing that makes her stand out compared to the other animatronics, that being her eyes. After this, we see this very heavy decline in her stability. She isn't able to keep this facade anymore, and she isn't even able to see herself in the mirror anymore. This tragic part of her character is just expanded upon in Ruin. And I'll be one to admit that after seeing the full section of shutting off Roxanne in Ruin for the first time, it nearly made me cry on stream. The scene is so well done and significantly shows the connection that Cassie has to Roxanne and how Roxanne has just gone down throughout the years. Even down to her still remembering Cassie's birthday and that she likes carrot cake. On top of this, she also comes to save us from the Mimic, and it's just a really good improvement to her character. Overall, I just love what Steel Wool did to improve Roxanne, and she isn't the only one who got a really good revamp. Moving on to Sun and Moon, we find ourselves a new character, Eclipse. And while we don't see him for long, it's still a really good way of completing Sun and Moon's character, showing us that they were never meant to be separated like they were. Eclipse is how they were always supposed to have been, not in a constant state of fighting for control between two extremely out-of-place characters. Probably one of my favorite fan medias to come out of original Security Breach was people's take on Eclipse. Even before Ruin, there was this general idea that Sun and Moon should have this third form that was called Eclipse, and we got that in Ruin. As separate character, Moon is way too aggressive to be left near children, especially since he'll come out when the lights are off, which is obviously a bad thing, as with most daycares or things that look after children, there will be allocated nap times, which I don't think you'd want an animatronic that becomes highly aggressive when the lights are dimmed to be around children. However, Sun isn't much better. He seems to be very overbearing and sounds like a goblin who swallowed a kazoo. Just neither one of the two seems to be good to be around children, and that's why Eclipse is the better option. Eclipse is the perfect combination of the two, keeping each other in balance to create a non-threatening and calm animatronic, which seems to be a lot more fitting to be looking after kids. I mean, just look at the differences between Sun kicking Gregory out of the daycare compared to Eclipse with Cassie. And yes, you could say that Sun acts like he does because Gregory broke a rule, but imagine if that was just some poor kid who didn't know any better. Eclipse just seems to be a much better fit, and it's even beneficial for the both of them. Now neither of them have to be blocked out by the other, and it's just a really good closure for the two characters. Now moving on to someone who, for a small while after the DLC was released, caused a little bit of confusion. I'm talking about Mr. Freddy Fazbear himself. From what I've seen of people playing the DLC, the main question had always been, what is Freddy gonna be like? And before we even see him, it was pretty rational to assume that, looking at the promotional material, that Freddy was either gonna be evil or sad. And well, one of those is correct, but not in the way that most of us would have expected. Coming to one of the final parts of the game, we enter Fazerblast, and there's writing all over the walls that say Bad Bear. And after walking around for a bit, we meet Mr. Fazbear covered in a pile of rubble, his head completely out of view, and we just assume that he's dead at first. I messed up a lot of speech then, but we're going with it. You know what I mean. His head is just completely out of view, and we can assume that he's dead until we walk up to him and he starts to get up in a really unexpected manner, twisting and turning around in this really unnatural way, only to reveal the gaping hole that is now his chest. We are then chased by Freddy, and after putting on the mask, he just disappears. I'd also like to point out that he's just completely missing a head. In the promotional material, he has a head. However, coming across this scene, it's just completely nowhere to be seen. And Freddy disappearing is probably the thing that caused the most confusion. But I really like that this is the way that Steelwool decided to go. It was really unexpected, and on my first time playing gave me quite a bit of a shock. I was expecting to have to go up with a fully upgraded Freddy like from the main game, but having this highly aggressive version of Freddy also gave us a hint to what the base game canon ending was. And it's just a really good decision. Having him without a head shows that whatever ending was the canon one is the one where Freddy's head gets taken off, which is the Princess Quest ending. Freddy's head is gone because, well, Gregory took Freddy's head with him. And yes, there's the whole debate on why does he say prototype on his foot. There's some reason for that. I don't know, but it just makes sense for the Freddy that doesn't have a head is probably the one from base game because Gregory took the head. It just makes sense. And now I'm going to combine both Chica and Monty into one section, as we don't really get anything significant with them. They're both just more run-down versions of their base game counterparts. But the way that they both evolve into different directions is a really good comparison as to how different the animatronics themselves are. First of all, talking about Chica, she doesn't really know what to do with herself most of the time anymore, and is most of the time either laying about or eating trash when we see her. The time of abandonment has not been kind to her, and I honestly kind of feel really bad for her. Even in the base game, all she really gets is the section of the sewers and doesn't really have much plot relevance or character to her. She just doesn't really seem to know what she's doing anymore and doesn't have any kind of purpose to do anymore. And it's actually a really tragic new part to her character. However, compare this to Monty, who has gone absolutely batshit in the time away from the Pizzaplex. He's lost all of his outer casing and is now more beast than he was before. Yes, he may have been an aggressive character even before Ruin, but at this point he's just lost everything and just runs around attacking anything he sees. While both characters might not have much in the way of additions, they're really good examples of how things have declined in the Pizzaplex since the main game. And just to top off this section, I just want to acknowledge the smaller characters like the Mini Music Men and the Staff Bots. They don't really change much, but they have a new rundown look to them, and the ones that have seemingly carved bunny ears onto themselves really intrigue me. But other than that, they don't really serve much else of a purpose. And yes, of course, I'm going to talk about the reveal of Glamrock Bonnie. We get to see that Fazbear Entertainment didn't do anything with him and just left him to rot behind the bowling alley. And it's all but confirmed that he was attacked by Monty at some point in time, and the story section we see with the gondolas is just a completely made up story to save face. But I do really enjoy that Steelwool gave us a bit of closure as to what happened with Bonnie. However, apart from that, there isn't really that much to talk about him. Now moving on to some of the newer characters, more specifically MXES, Helpy, and the Mimic, And yes, I know that Helpy isn't exactly new, but he's gotten to be more than just a visual mascot and is actually a full character now. Helpy's a character that I'm glad got this new relevance as a mascot, being something that actually helps us throughout the DLC more than just visually just a little guy that's there. And his personality especially makes him like me more. Specifically on the section where he corrects Cassie in the main AI room, talking about saying she should be safe and not that she would be safe. It's just little things like that that make me enjoy him as a character, and I'm sure that all the weird glitchy things that happen with him every now and then has some kind of plot relevance, but to my knowledge he's just a little guy for the most part. MXES is a character that has to be one of my favorite designs in the whole franchise, and I'll be honest when I say that I'm glad that Steelwool chose his in-game design over whatever his older design was. MXES doesn't have much of a personality, as he doesn't speak at all, but he's just this constant presence which, whilst playing the game for the first time, could be perceived as him being the bad guy, and I even thought that he was the Mimic until I finished the game. Just looking at his physical design, he matches the AR environment so well, and is a massive improvement to Burntrap, who was previously our main antagonist, if we're talking about that specific ending. And while we're talking about that, MXES is such a better antagonist, quote-unquote, because he actually is there for most of the game. Unlike Burntrap and Vanny, he is a constant threat that we have to worry about, and not just, ooh, he shows up for one scene and then never again, big reveal kind of thing. And even though this happens again with the Mimic, it does it in a way that actually works for the plot. And well, obviously moving on to the Mimic himself, it's, like I said before, he's a massive improvement from base game antagonists, and even though he only shows up at the end of the game, this actually works well this time, because it's what the whole game has been building up to, not just, oh, this is happening now. The final reveal that the whole time you've not been working with Gregory and you've been tricked by a killer AI was a great reveal. Even if it was kind of predictable if you already knew about the Mimic from the books, it was still really well executed, and that final chase sequence still leaves questions to if we're actually even talking to the real Gregory at the end or not. Especially at the end of the elevator section, and don't even get me started on its physical design. Out of all the game's endoskeletons, I've got to say that by far the Mimic is the best one we've gotten. He just looks so cool, and he's this mishmashed amalgamation of parts from other endoskeletons, but still manages to give us something new, even managing to confirm that the books are actually relevant to the games, and I love the Mimic for that. It starts to give into this idea that FNAF is starting to go into this new direction, and fixing what was probably one of my biggest frustrations with the lore before. In FNAF 6, we see all of the game's main characters and spirits finally being put to rest, only for Security Breach to come back, being all like, no, they're actually still coming back again. With the addition of the books, and things being brought up with the different forms of the Mimic AI instead of it just being Peepaw William coming back from the grave for the 50th time. Overall, what I would call the biggest improvement in Ruin is it gives us this new era of FNAF. One that isn't the same story being told over and over again. And while some may think that that makes the story too complex, it's FNAF. The story has always been about it being complex and all over the place. Get over yourself. And this can be said about the people worrying that FNAF is turning too much in a game made for kids, but forget that most of us were kids when the series came out. Which can be said about a lot of horror games nowadays, and it's because that's what gives them popularity. The only way that I can see that being a bad thing is when the quality of the series is completely lost because of just trying to be popular, which can't be said for FNAF. The quality of the series hasn't been lost, and Ruin just confirms this. The hope that Ruin has given me for this franchise is unparalleled, and I have very high hopes to what Steelwool will give us in the future, now that they have a pretty good idea of what works with FNAF and what doesn't. I mean, every franchise has its ups and downs, and I mean going back to even older FNAF games, I think that Sister Location is probably one of the worst games in the franchise, and yet it managed to come back stronger and even better with FNAF 6. This isn't the first time that we've gotten a bad FNAF game and improved, and if FNAF continues to make more games for itself, it probably won't be the last. But no matter what happens, I think that the franchise is going into good hands, especially with the movie and Help Wanted 2 coming up soon. I cannot wait to see where Steelwool takes us next, if Ruin has anything to go by. But that's why I think that Ruin is an improvement to Security Breach, and I hope to see you in my next video. I'm planning on making more FNAF themed videos in the future, and if you don't want to miss those, I suggest you stick around and subscribe. But thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.